Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar here, Cybersecurity and Data, Safely Driving Value. I'm happy to be here today with Matt Gantner, founder and CEO of Altum Strategy Group. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. But what we really want to try to get to is driving value here safely, making sure data is available, and as this data certainly is more and more in use and in abundance, we need to figure out a way to make it secure as it is useful. So again, I'm here to happy to introduce myself. My name is Ron Pelletier. I'm the founder and chief customer officer at Pondurance LLC. Now, we are a full services cybersecurity firm providing managed services to monitor and respond to events, to protect client data assets, as well as professional advisory to help build and manage cybersecurity programs. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Ron, and thanks for having me today. Again, my name is Matt Gantner. I'm the founder and CEO of Altum Strategy Group. Altum Strategy Group is a business and digital technology consulting firm that focuses on helping companies really make sense of their data and leverage their data to drive greater results when it comes to revenue generation, risk mitigation, and return on investment. So again, thank you for having me.
Okay, great. Well, here we are again. We're going to be talking about how leaders can install this data-driven and security-aware culture, and so let's just go ahead and get started there. I think, Matt, let's just ask the question directly: how can leaders instill a data-driven culture in their organizations? More specifically, what does this require leaders to do? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it really starts with leaders really understanding the data. And really, in today's world, as you touched on briefly during your opening remarks, data is all around us. And leaders now have an unprecedented amount of data that they have access to that's both been created internally within their organizations, as well as through third parties. And in order for data to really be meaningful, it needs to be maintained and taken care of in order to drive the insights, the actions, and ultimately the outcomes that leaders and organizations are looking to achieve. And to take that even one step deeper, leaders can really set the example and set the tone for instilling that data-driven culture by really leading by example and making sure that as they go through their thought process, they're leveraging data as much as they can. It also goes to providing continuing education and training to help the organization as a whole understand what data they have access to and understanding how they can use data to make meaningful decisions. It's also tied to the communication and empowerment. So having that ongoing drumbeat of communication as to what is data, why is this important to us, where are we able to use it, and also where are we not able to use it, ultimately will drive the empowerment of that use of data across that organization, as well as through any partners that are collaborating with that organization. And then overall, leaders should really take the time to celebrate the wins. Right? There's no win that's too big or too small, really, when it comes to data and the use of data. And instilling that culture, celebrate wins of all sizes. Another thing that's important for leaders to remember is that, everybody's looking for kind of a silver bullet to help, either weather the storm that we're currently in or plan for the future. It's important to remember that the data journey is truly a journey, right? And that it's going to require time, and it's not going to happen overnight. The journey, it's going to have a lot of ups and downs, twists and turns that leaders have to anticipate and be ready for. It's also going to require money and investment, and that investment can take the form of hiring new people that have skill sets or competencies that the organization doesn't have today. It's going to be potentially either optimizing existing tools or implementing new tools. And then it's also going to take the form of providing training to folks that are now empowered to use that data. It's also going to require talent and a mind shift in talent and ultimately data governance.
Yeah, Matt, we certainly live in this interconnected world. I couldn't agree with you more that this journey does start from the top, but with this vast dependency on data sharing for business efficiency and ultimately efficacy, we need data to make data, and additional data, metadata points are needed to, provide sufficient context, right? And so leadership needs to really embrace making data accessible and even more available, but not reduce the due diligence required to sufficiently protect it. Right? So making it available doesn't avail the need for strong access controls, for instance, that really need to start at ensuring that end users need access to the data in the first place. And then what type of access is needed, established by role and intended use. Now, that's just talking about best practices for sharing internal data. If we shift, quickly here to talking about sharing data more broadly for the good of all, and let's face it, I'm referring to the information sharing and analysis centers, the ISACs, and there's one for just about every industry now, from healthcare to financial services to even critical infrastructure. And what if these individual contributors, as well as the organizations, choose to withhold this data and not share it? I mean, we're talking about things like indicators of compromise, best practices, incident response playbooks, and a host of other dynamic and evolving threat data that serves really the broader community and keeps everyone more prepared. So the bottom line is that leaders should embrace responsible information sharing, and that includes responsible disclosure of information, because you can do harm with releasing information in an unvetted manner, so that we can work together in our collective fight against bad actors, certainly. So, let's maybe shift the conversation and talk about risk mitigation and regulatory compliance here. So, I guess, Matt, talking about, how do the data forward principles and data governance 2.0 help companies mitigate risk? And even further, how should organizations take a risk conscious and more of an in compliance stance or approach to handling data while increasing the visibility overall?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of companies are grappling with, right? The first thing to understand is that the transition from data governance 1.0 to 2.0 really requires a mind shift at a company and at an individual level. The reason for that is because data governance is founded on the principles of really being agile and having more of a decentralized approach to leveraging both unstructured data and structured data when making decisions or collaborating on what a decision may be. So with that as a backdrop, for companies that are looking to harness data governance 2.0, you're really going to be able to position yourself and really achieve kind of 4 macro level things. One is, by moving to a data governance 2.0 posture, you're going to be able to decentralize your understanding of data and therefore put those decisions in the hands of folks that are closest to it. By doing so, you're removing or mitigating some of that risk that may be present in organizations that are more centrally governed and may not have the greatest visibility or hands on the data on a day-to-day basis. The second macro piece is, by shifting to data governance 2.0, you're going to be able to understand data quicker and ultimately make decisions that are going to allow you to adjust your business model and therefore capture more revenue. And that could be through growing your existing market share and or pivoting into a new market or a new offering. The third kind of macro achievement is really making sure that you're driving the return on your investment, right? So you're able to then measure, monitor, and take action on the data that you're seeing and really make sure that you're prioritizing investment, adding additional investment where needed, especially for those high growth items, and then de-risking your investment for areas that aren't growing as quickly. And then the fourth kind of macro piece is just driving greater resilience. Right? By understanding your data, you're going to be able to position yourself to be more resilient and let the data help you look around the corner and see where the market or the economy may be going, and ultimately position yourself to come out ahead of that next wave.
Yeah, I love what you said about resilience, especially about understanding your data, and we'll get to that a little bit more in just a second. But when you think about, from my perspective, data governance practices within an organization, well, they're really only as good as they are articulated, tested for effectiveness to ensure that they're intended to work as they should, and enforced through a mix of technical and procedural controls. And a lot of that starts not just at the top, but with good documentation as well. I always say that policies and procedures and standards, for instance, is not just a rote exercise of documenting things for the good of an audit, but it is certainly going to drive consistency, continuity of practices, so that if people leave, new people come in, or assuring that you've got something that works and sufficiently mitigates your risk to keep doing that. And so the documentation can certainly, do it. But again, something that has to start at the top. It has to filter down to the rest of the organization, really the importance of data handling, right? So whereas policies and procedures may be specific to certain groups within an organization, maybe they don't have to be shared entirely, but there is going to be one set of steps or considerations, or I should say minimum baselines requirements, that we call typically a user acceptance policy. And that can articulate, again, those minimum expectations of all users, both internal and external, about data usage, handling, overall care, and adherence to good cybersecurity practices. So again, this is something we want everybody in the organization to be familiar with. We have to make sure we test their knowledge of it. We have to make sure that we do training consistently and even put it into practice, whether it's phishing email campaigns or things like that that can work internally. But all of the controls can be tailored into action, and a good framework, for instance, like the NIST, what we like to use is the cybersecurity framework. Just the whole concept of, again, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, this triad, it's not just a cliche. It's really something, if you think about, each one has an intent and they all work together. So before we can meet those regulatory, compliance needs and follow those best practices, it's really incumbent upon the organization, again, as you said, to first understand the data that it has in its custody. How does it come into the organization? How do I receive it? How does it flow? Who does it belong to, right? Is it my data? Is it data that belongs to somebody else that I'm now in custody of? Where does it live within my organization? Is it on-prem? Is it in the cloud? Is it on specific resources? And then how is it protected, and who needs access to it? So to whom or where does it go? How is it transported? How does it leave the organization? Where does it go, from there? So all that really is wrapped around a good data flow exercise, and that's a critical success factor for duly protecting data according to its sensitivity and certainly its worth. But if we move on to balancing data as an asset and the cybersecurity implications, therein, let's talk about this and I guess, Matt, from your perspective, there's really a one-size-fits-all approach to balancing cybersecurity and the desire to leverage the asset of data to drive value. I have my own thoughts in this, and are there nuances, right? Company culture and unique circumstances that can drive, some of these factors that organizations can find themselves in, in a given situation at a time. So, what are your thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, it's a question that we're often asked, and the short answer is no. There is unfortunately no one-size-fit-all approach to balancing cybersecurity and leveraging data as an asset. Every company in various industries is a little bit nuanced, and those nuances need to be taken into consideration as you look at that balance point between cybersecurity and data. So in addition, Ron, as you touched on, to culture, there's also additional considerations around company size. So how small, how big are they? How complex are they? And in what industry do they operate? Is it a very regulated industry, such as, for example, pharma? What are the types of data that they're trying to leverage as an asset, right? It's really important to understand, right? Your customer data is going to be different than your third-party vendor data. So using those two as example, customer and vendor, how do you use that data? How do you store that data? To your point just a minute ago, Ron, who within the organization has their hands on that data? That's very important. And then it's also important to take into consideration, what are the growth drivers for the company? Where are they today? Where do they want to go, in 2, 3, 5 years from now? And what are the drivers that they view are going to help them get there? And then how does data play into those drivers to help them reach their objective?
Right, and those growth drivers can certainly, direct a personality, if you will, or a way of handling data between high risk appetite, low risk appetite, and we're going to get to that. I guess I want to echo your thoughts and add that the approach to balance good cybersecurity depends on organizational risk tolerance. I mean, I know that sounds like a lot of consultant speak when you put it like that, but if you think about it, if you're an organization that has a lower appetite for risk, then you're going to want more security in place. That's just the way you function, the way you think, the way you can allow yourself to sleep at night. And you're going to want more just general granulated control. So if you have a higher appetite for risk, then you'll accept a lesser, maybe albeit not irresponsible, certainly, security posture. So I always talk about polarizing opposites, the spectrum, where I start with Fort Knox and then there's Swiss cheese. Fort Knox being, of course, we can tolerate zero risk. We don't want nothing to happen to us, and we're going to act like we're protecting all the gold in the world. And then you've got Swiss cheese, which is fairly porous and head in the sand, sort of context. Now, no organization really can be on either side, right? So you have to find that leeway to find that right level of control, and the key is not to over-engineer your program more toward Fort Knox or under-engineer your program either. You got to find that balance in the middle, and that's what we're really talking about when we talk about just getting that organizational risk tolerance. So your business drivers, as you touched on, are going to influence that greatly. But then there's the type of data you have. Is it governed by regulatory compliance? What about its availability overall? What about my other stakeholders? So all that needs to be thought about, as you're building your program. So if you're going to democratize, your data and create a valuable source of truth, right, for your organization, be it for any operational aspect of what you're doing, you have to make sure the integrity of that data is solid and it can be impeccably trusted, right? If data suddenly becomes not, trustworthy, then you have a big problem in the organization. But if that data then, as I mentioned, has privacy implications wrapped around of data governance by law or other rule sets, then that's something else to think about too. So I'd argue that availability of data is equal no matter what type of organization you are, because again, if you're not having that data available to you in the right way when you need it, then some serious consequences can certainly result from that. So let's focus on some of the high risk appetite organizations first. I mean, Matt, so in your estimation, how can companies with a high risk appetite find that balance between strong cybersecurity infrastructure and having increased visibility into their data in order to extract its value and make it useful?
I would say that, in the context of past, present, future, high growth companies historically haven't been able to necessarily, during the growth curve, really strike that balance well. They typically have to strike that as they become a much larger company. I think that if you look at companies now, especially since 2020 to current, a lot of companies that are going through high growth have really had to contend with how do employees and partners, both on site as well as remotely, access my data, and what data do they have access to. So you've seen more of a lean in on understanding, one, kind of what is my data, who has access to it, what are the data controls in place, and really going to the next step of performing that data classification. So that way they can really tie, the security measures around those different data types to that classification. I think we've also seen a lot of companies really lean into analytics and really leveraging tools to drive out KPIs and more importantly, where my data is going throughout the life cycle within the business to manage it, monitor it, report on it, and take action on it to really mitigate any risk of data exposure. We've also seen a number of high growth companies put in a lot of continuous education, making sure people understand their data, understand who has access to it, what's appropriate use, what's inappropriate use. And that's allowed them to have more of a focused approach for audits and assessments. And really, instead of kind of boiling the ocean on certain types of assessments, they're really able to target the areas where their data is greatest at risk, either from a posture or security posture, a readiness, or just an overall usability perspective.
Yeah, certainly. And, I think to echo what we've said and support what you just said, as well, and frankly, reiterate what we said earlier, you still have to know your current state of data flow and the security control posture there. And again, what type of data do I have coming in? What type of data is leaving? And what am I doing with it in between? Right. And so there's still that due care or level of responsibility that any organization, even those with a higher appetite for risk, that they have to maintain. So essentially, it boils down to you've got to know your true risk if you're going to accept it and adopt a lesser control posture. Again, not equating that to an irresponsible control posture, but one that certainly might be, less stringent. So there are still minimum control considerations to employ. Otherwise, you make yourself a likely target for a breach. And these are the organizations certainly that I would encourage to make yourself, in some cases, even just good enough. Stay on top of what the security trends are. It doesn't mean you have to go so deep in layers and layers of redundancy in your control. But think about this. And I like to use this analogy of two people running through the woods and both are being chased by a bear. You don't have to outrun the bear, right? That's the flippant, discussion about, certainly run the other person, then they become a target, then you're free. The key there is really to make sure that you're understanding how the bad actors work. They're opportunists. They're going to knock on doors. They're going to knock on windows. They're going to try the gates. They're going to try things, at the surface level. And if you can be just good enough and avoid that, they're going to move on and they're going to go for easier targets. So that's something, to think about. Take an example of encryption, for instance, in transit, it's important, but maybe if you're a higher risk, a high appetite for risk, rather, organization, maybe encryption at rest is not something that you need to do, for instance, or maybe, putting it all in the cloud or putting it all on-prem. You can work, high appetite for risk into both of those scenarios. But again, it's making sure you do the exercise of understanding what the risk is before you can make those decisions. So if we shift then, Matt, to low to moderate risk appetite organizations and the approach to building or balancing cybersecurity, let's ask this conversely then: how would a company with such an adopted policy of moderate appetite find balance between strong cybersecurity infrastructure and having increased visibility into their data in order to extract its value?
Yeah, I would say similar to the high growth, there's going to be similar considerations for, more low risk to moderate risk organizations. So I'm going to touch on those in just 1 second. But Ron, I just want to build on something you just said, because for folks out there that may be curious, like, how do I even build a risk program? As Ron mentioned, bad actors will knock on doors, knock on windows, try and open your garage door, for example. It's really important to understand where your potential threat areas lie. And that could be around cybersecurity, that could be around business operations, that could also be around kind of financial reporting. So just using those three as an example, it's really important to understand your risks holistically and then really drill down into the cybersecurity impact and also the data impact that may occur across your overall risk profile. So with that as a backdrop and as a segue, really for those companies that are lower risk but still growing well, it's really important for them to start off with audit and assessment. So if you remember just a minute ago, I touched on audit and assessment as kind of the last piece for high growth. It's the inverse for more low to moderate growth and lower risk, because it's important to make sure that the audits and assessments are performed first. So that way it allows them to identify where their pain points are, understand those risks, and then put together the pragmatic program to go through data governance, all the way through data classification, continue to provide that continuous education for all the data stewards or the folks that are actually hands on the keys with the data, and then layer on those analytics to help manage, monitor, report, and really action decisions or events around that data. So similar approaches to both high growth or high risk and low risk organizations. It's just a matter of how you sequence that based on, again, your overall risk approach.
Yeah, the sequence and the granularity, right? A little bit more, deeper into things. And I think that from my perspective, the low to moderate appetite organizations, or those with the lower moderate appetite for risk, they're going to start in the same direction. They have to, right? Let's get the inventory of what we have. Let's classify it. Let's do all of these things to make sure we know what we have. Let's understand our threats and then what the control posture is. But they're going to want to add another lens of circumspection. It's also going to consider, potentially quantifiable impacts should that critical data be breached or otherwise, be made unavailable. So they're going to want to understand at a little bit level deeper because maybe they've been bitten before, right? I think organizations that have gone through a breach situations, I had one, client tell me, I wish I could tell everybody how terrible it is. You can think about it, you can try to put it in perspective, but until you're, in the trenches, it's not something you can fully, imagine, right? And so, being able to, making sure that you understand, that doesn't mean that you have to be Fort Knox, right? Because I'm still going to caution every organization, even if you have, been bitten, by an incident, not to over-engineer your program. It starts to become costly. It starts to become unwieldy, untenable in a lot of ways, and then you can make yourself even more insecure if you try to put too much on and then topple over. Right. So I think one of the risks with the low risk appetite organizations, they tend to rely heavily on redundancy of controls, which, technology, they rely, unduly on that sometimes. It can overwhelm them in terms of overall maintenance and even costs, right, for maintenance, and actually more impede their operations. So the lesson, that I think it's important to remember that you should conform your operating and data environments to suit your needs. Find that level of risk tolerance, understand the needs of the organization and those of your stakeholders and what they expect. But if you strive for a zero defect or zero risk, you become a technology company at that point, and your expenditures to maintain that take away from the budget for the other operations. You need balance in that. You can't air gap things. If you're going to go for segregation, do I need to segregate everything, right? So you have to make sure data is going to flow in its due way, but then find out where the key risk areas are and then focus your control balance in that manner. So, a great discussion so far. And, let's turn now to the future of data governance and cybersecurity. So I guess, Matt, what do you see developing over the next few years in regard to how companies govern their data with the goal of driving value and how cybersecurity can keep up with it?
Yeah, I think just to start, just to reiterate kind of where we started, is that data is all around us. And I think that the speed and the volume of data creation and consumption is only going to accelerate. I think that's going to be tied largely to the use of and companies wanting to adopt machine learning all the way through artificial intelligence. And I think that as companies begin to harness more of their data, they're going to continue to look at data-driven decisions. So the need for greater volumes of data to support both the data-driven decisions as well as the march towards an artificial intelligence and embedding that in the business is only going to go up. So as a result, the need for managing risk, as we just kind of briefly talked through in a number of different facets, as well as data governance and cybersecurity protections, is going to become even more paramount than it is today in order to help companies really kind of put the right guardrails and frameworks in place to manage their business, mitigate the risks, and ultimately come out as kind of leaders in their respective areas or industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that certainly cloud computing is going to get more and more attention as time goes on, as more organizations move, away from self-hosting. And I agree, Matt, with everything you're saying. We're going to continue to see unprecedented speeds matched by only by really unprecedented demand, of data, and with machine learning and artificial intelligence, already having gained significant strides. I think the automated pull of data from vast sources is probably going to shock some people. The surprise being really the type of data that is actually available and can be harvested, online. We're talking about far reaches of the internet now that can be instantaneous. And so I think with that, there's going to be probably a tendency, and it's happening already. I think more generations will be a little bit more complacent or willingly forsake privacy for that overall convenience. And that's going to continue to offer challenges to the cybersecurity industry and companies overall, particularly when you've got in the other direction new rules and regulations that are just coming out at a prodigious rate by governments and as well as industries. And so all of that's going to come to a head at some point. I think certainly data integrity is always going to be sought, especially in this era of information, right, where we seek it and a lot of it is out there. How do you discern the good data, from the bad data? I mean, technologies like encryption, have been in play and will continue to be important, but even things like blockchain are certainly coming on to the horizon pretty quickly, and particularly for those cloud-based infrastructures or architectures. So being able to leverage, some of those I think are going to be important. And then of course there's the unknown, right, that's out there. I really do think that artificial intelligence, especially this year, really crept up more quickly than maybe people thought, it would. Is it, certainly what it was always cracked up to be? No, but I think the strides it made are compelling, right? And people are recognizing now because it certainly can replace people in a lot of ways, creating, again, some of that automation. Now, what if quantum computing suddenly goes mainstream? I think we could see a whole new array of change to the way we handle and use data, and there's going to be some great impacts and challenges that every organization therein is certainly going to have to face. So those are the questions that I had for you, Matt. It was a great discussion. Again, I want to thank Matt Gantner from Altum, and again, Ron Pelletier with Pondurance. I'm happy to be part of this, and want to thank everyone for participating in our webinar. Matt, I'd like to invite you for any closing thoughts you might have on what we discussed today.
Yeah, first off, Ron, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And I think just to kind of wrap up my thoughts, to everything you were touching on about the unknowns, be it AI, machine learning, quantum computing, and other areas that we talked about throughout today's session, I think some other things for folks just to keep in mind is that as we continue into 2024 and beyond, it's going to also be really important for them to take in consideration some of the other factors beyond technology that are impacting business. And that could be, for example, what's going on, from a geopolitical perspective right now, and really understanding how those types of factors and events really impact their business. So I would leave that as a parting thought, just to kind of build on additionally looking at, your business and your risk holistically. So thank you again for having me.
Well, thank you, Matt. The world certainly is changing, and excited to see where it goes. But I want to thank you again, Matt Gantner, from the founder and CEO of Altum Strategy Group, and myself, Ron Pelletier, founder and Chief Customer Officer with Pondurance. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good day.